All right. It looks like we are alive and well. Thank you to those of you who are joining us live, and those of you watching on the Young People's Ministries YouTube channel. Thanks for checking out the archived version of this Hangout. My name's Chris, and I'm in the Young People's Ministries office in Nashville. We're part of the General Board of Discipleship, and I'm super, super excited to be able to interview Sam Halverson today. Who, besides being part of the connection within the United Methodist Church, also has a new book that's just come out through the Youth Cartel. Sam, do you mind introducing yourself real quick, and instead of me having say all sorts of nice things for you?
I don't mind listening to that, but yeah, I'm Sam Halverson. I'm Associate Director of Connectional Ministries in the North Georgia Conference. That just means I serve on staff at the North Georgia Conference office, but my main position there is working with youth and young adult ministries in the conference. So I'm a consultant and a resource person for the United Methodist churches, for the congregations and the pastors and the youth ministry teams, parent teams, search committees, things like that around the area of youth ministry and young adults.
Perfect, perfect. And you also have one of the really cool jobs where you get to like go out and have coffee with youth ministers and
Yeah, I do that a lot.
talk about stuff. It's a good deal.
Coffee and lunch and breakfast and an opportunity to meet with them and find out how we can help them and be resources for them in the conference, but also to show our appreciation for the time and the energy and the ministry that they provide to their congregations, to their communities.
I would imagine that over some of those cups of coffee is maybe where some of the seeds of this book started to be planted. The book that we're going to be talking about that you just had come out through the Youth Cartel is called One Body, Integrating Teenagers into the Life of Your Church. And I would imagine that as you consult and talk about folks, you see, youth ministry setups in a lot of different ways. Even within the North Georgia Conference, I know there's a lot of different ways of doing youth ministry. But you kind of kick off the book talking about like youth ministry silos, and I think that that's language that a lot of us are familiar with. But tell us a little bit about your observations there, and maybe some of the tension that you see between things that help youth ministry and maybe hurt youth ministry.
Yeah, youth ministry silos, basically the many churches, we fall into that trap of building a silo, meaning a program that is so wrapped within itself that people who are involved in that program or in that setup don't really associate much with things outside the silo. A youth can be very, very active in the youth ministry programming, in the youth ministry silo per se, and all through their 6 years of youth ministry, or however many it is in that particular church, and then feel totally unable to relate to the congregation once they're out of the silo, and confused at that. And I have over 30 years of youth ministry experience in the local church, and I've seen so many youth over those decades who, when they became young adults, would talk to me about the churches that they would be looking for, and their comments would be something along the line of, "We're having trouble finding a church that is similar to youth group when I was in youth group."
Mm.
And then when I a few years ago started going to some of the youth specialties conventions and listened in on the Sticky Faith information that Kara Powell and the folks over at Fuller Youth Institute had discovered and really started talking about, it started to connect with some of those comments of the youth. The point being that they did some research and discovered that young adults who were involved in the church as teenagers, when they became young adults, if they were only involved in the youth ministry program, that is not necessarily going to worship, not necessarily being involved in other ministries in the church, but just the youth ministry things, that they were much more likely to not remain active in the church than those youth who were also involved in whole church worship, in helping with the nursery, helping with VBS, singing in the church choir, going to events or ministries that took place with the whole congregation, as opposed to just the youth ministry. That and then also reading Mark Ostreicher's Youth Ministry 3.0. Those two things really connected with me around 2009, 2010, right in there. And I started realizing I want to do youth ministry a little bit differently than the way I'd been doing it.
I feel like the key word that you tossed in there was the program, right?
Yeah.
Like for those that have read Youth Ministry 3.0, it's a lot of conversation about moving from Youth Ministry 2.0, right, which was that program-based, space-based kind of idea, into something that's a little bit more smaller, a little bit more involved, a little bit more intimate.
A little bit more relational.
Yeah, yeah.
Actually, maybe, and I don't want anybody to confuse that by hearing me say that we need to get rid of our programs, because I think programs are a great tool that we can use in the church, but there's a lot of tools that we can use. And if we focus too much on programs, or focus in the wrong way on programs, we can become program driven. And I don't think we're called to be that. We're called to be a presence ministry to our kids, not just the kids in our churches, but the kids in our community. And when those teenagers recognize or interpret that the reason why we're in a relationship is to feed our program, which may or may not be the main reason we do it, but if they see that, if they connect me talking to them because I want them always to come to my program, then it looks like I've got other reasons for being in relationship with them.
The relationship is such a key piece of things, and as you try to escape the sort of the systematic setup of silos, I think that's the key to kind of breaking out of that way of being in ministry. The silo conversation that you start off the book with really resonated for me. I actually grew up in the Dakotas as well, so.
Oh yeah, that's right. I forgot about that.
Weird thing that we have in common. I lived in Mitchell before moving to Denver. But I thought about your imagery of the silo, and how it is a place for storing and preparing and tucking something away. And it made me think of some of the hidden costs of those silos, right? Because farmers build those things because it's the best place to, keep something safe and out of the way.
Mm-hmm.
But then you have to do upkeep on that structure as well. And so when I think about siloed ministries, I find myself thinking about the energy that youth ministers spend, or other church leaders spend for that matter, kind of keeping up the silo as well. When you've got a program-based something as opposed to a relationship-based something, you're investing so much time and energy into the program or into the space as opposed to into people. I think that really is one of the big divides or the shifts that needs to happen when you're talking about that relational piece.
Yeah, yeah, and there's a tension there, because definitely some of the things that build up the silo also strengthen my youth ministry.
Mm-hmm.
If I've got a youth space, a really good youth space, then that in most cases really does help my youth ministry. But if I use that youth space in a way that it alienates the rest of the congregation, or that it only becomes this protective harbor, or this shell that holds the youth in and keeps them out of the rest of the congregation or the rest of the church, then it's becoming harmful. We would love to have our own youth building. I've seen some amazing youth buildings here in North Georgia, and the youth ministers there, for the most part, wouldn't want to give them up, but they also recognize that if they continue to stay separated from the church, not just physically, but if that physical separation comes into the mindset of the whole congregation of we've got a place for our youth and they're over there and we'll drop them off before church and pick them up after church, then it starts to be harmful. I think the tension in our youth ministry is to try to figure out how can we feed into the things that unify our youth ministry, while at the same time show that unity as the whole body, instead of just this parasite that feeds off of church, as some people have recognized it to be.
I think one of the other challenges of that is when you've got your own youth space or your own youth program, it ends up being really easy to like count numbers and base your
Yeah.
success off those numbers, right? And you do spend some time talking about that in the book as well. So I wanted to get some thoughts from you about, what are the suggestions for some things that churches can measure when they're talking about success, that aren't necessarily, number or attendance driven.
Yeah, it's one of the easiest ways for people to determine. And when I've gone out and spoken with churches about this kind of new look on youth ministry, or this different view that so many have taken up now, I'll get some of the personnel committee, or as in the United Methodist Church, the staff parish committee people, who will say, well, how are we supposed to measure the success of our youth ministry if we're not looking at the numbers? And I think that in a lot of ways has to do with the individual congregations, but I would call the congregations to look beyond the numbers. I mean, I do believe that in some ways they need to keep track of how many. I mean, otherwise I wouldn't be supporting vital congregations, and I want to look at that as one way of recognizing a success. But I think it goes much further. We've discovered over the years the things that help youth ministry to be sustainable. Mark DeVries and Youth Ministry Architects have that wonderful resource, Sustainable Youth Ministry, and with the Sticky Faith information, we discover that that having youth involved in worship, not just as participants, but I mean not just as members of the congregation, but participants in the carrying on of worship. That having relationships among the youth and the adults in the church, that adults that are not necessarily the volunteers in the youth program, being in relationship with the parents of the youth, having connections with them and helping them in the way that they build up the faith of their own kids. These are some of the things that help sustainable youth ministry, and they may not be as measurable as counting your numbers every week and determining if you've gone up or down, but really over a few months, over a year or so, you can look and see how many youth are participating in worship, how many recognize that as a way of being involved in the congregation. If a congregation has that goal of developing a congregational relationship with our teenagers, then it will become measurable in some ways, and I think much more sustainable.
Yeah, that almost makes me jump ahead in the list of questions that I put together for us, but it makes me think of the section where you talk about the ratios. Being somebody that is in the UMC and is really familiar with safe sanctuary stuff, like, I think of, oh yes, of course, 2 to 10, 1 to 5, whatever we're going to be. But you spend some time, flipping that on its head and saying, okay, so if our goal is congregational life with our youth, how many adults can you have play parts in the lives of a youth, and how do youth leaders, ministers start to track and pay attention to that?
Well, the safe sanctuary ratio is one we need to keep in mind. I mean, having 2 adults with a small group, making sure that when you go on retreats, you have about 1 adult for every 5 youth, 6 youth, but at least 2 on the trip. But this other ratio that I talk about in there is really one that I learned from Chap Clark, also over at Fuller. Chap often will bring up this ratio of 5 to 1. But his point is no longer that we need to have 1 adult for every 5 youth, which was the way I always learned in all my years of youth ministry, in making sure that I had enough adults for the dreaded lock-in or the retreat. But his point is to have 5 adults for every 1 youth connected to the youth in your congregation. And I mentioned in the book that to make sure that those adults are not just your volunteers in your youth group. These adults need to be people who are in your congregation. The single mother that brings her kids in, that sits across the pew from the youth, the head usher, the greeter, the singers in the choir, all these different people that youth will recognize at church, and people who will just. My goal is that any teenager who walks into the sanctuary on Sunday morning will be sure that that there are a number of adults in that church that will intentionally make their way across the sanctuary to greet that person by name, because they feel that confident about coming up and talking to them. Which means that we as youth ministers really need to do some work at helping the youth feel confident about that, but B, helping the adults in our churches feel confident in just talking to teenagers, sharing their story, or asking the youth to share their story. And it doesn't have to be anything real deep. It could just be coming up and saying, how was your week? If the kid plays on football, how did the game go? Or how did the basketball game go? Or how's it going with the practices for the spring play, or whatever it might be that they know that the kid is involved in. Or, I'm praying for you every day.
Yeah, and I would use the image of the theme song from Cheers, but millennials wouldn't get that for most parts. But maybe they would. Maybe it's retro enough that it's like back in. Yeah. But it's a place where your name is known, and it's also a place that I think your ideas about silo and physical space come into play as well, because to develop those relationships, you do have to have adults and youth in the same places, right? And not just around programs. If you've got a youth space that there's like a door that the youth come in and out of, and there's that secret stairway that they take up to get to the donuts, like was in my church, they don't find themselves in those places where that natural intergenerational action can take place. And that's where so much of the richness of the whole life of the church can come from.
Oh, I agree.
So we talked about the questions, between adults and youth, to kind of start building some of those relationships. Let's take a step back towards church staff, youth leaders, and that idea of numbers and success and that kind of stuff. What are some questions that we could start asking to get away from some numbers-based answers in terms of success? And I bring that up, being somebody that came from the local church as well. Before I was at GBOD, my senior pastor would be like, okay, so Sunday night, how'd youth group go? How many kids were there?
How many were there?
Yeah. It was like one question smushed together, right? So how can we start moving beyond that? What are some other questions we can start asking?
Oh, it would be great if my senior pastors were always asking things after retreats or youth meetings of, what did you talk about? What did you talk about Sunday night? What kind of, were there any great faith questions that came up from the kids over the weekend? Any stories? And here's where I think the youth minister has so much that he or she can develop in the ministry at the church. What kinds of stories did you connect with that can connect with our congregation? A youth minister spends time with the teenagers and hopefully spends time with the congregation members so that he or she can start connecting those stories to start fostering those relationships. People have asked me, why should we hire a youth minister if all we're doing is farming out the duties of the congregation? In other words, the congregation has taken a vow, we'll live our lives according to Christ, according to the example of Christ, that this child, surrounded by steadfast love, will be established in the faith and confirmed and strengthened in the way that leads us to life eternal. The baptismal vow. And so, as a youth minister, I'm in a great opportunity to be able to look at the stories, listen to the stories of my teenagers, and the stories of the adults in my church, and start connecting those. Relational ways that their stories might be similar or very different, but at least interesting to each other and connecting to each other.
It certainly does put the youth minister in a really, really strong place when they're developing those relationships with congregation members that don't necessarily have youth either. As I was going through the book, I thought of the disciple classes that my church would offer, during the week, during the daytime.
Yeah.
And I would try to be in one of those, just to be part of conversations and meet folks that I wouldn't otherwise normally be able to be in a class with. And you're right, there's a dynamic that pops up when a youth leader finds themselves in a situation where they are not in charge of leading youth stuff.
Yeah.
Instead, they are, sort of a curator of relationships of sorts.
And even when they're in those positions, when they go and visit at the hospital with somebody who's not in any relationship with a youth, or when they go to a UMW luncheon or a Bible study of just adults, the congregation sees them as the youth minister, and makes that connection with the youth ministry of the church, even if the youth minister is teaching a bunch of adults in a Bible study or participating as a student when there. And I think that ends up helping the youth ministry and making that connection. And it's a great example not only to the adults seeing that, but it's also a great example to the youth. When the youth see that the youth minister is breaking out of the silo himself or herself and spending time with other ministries in the church that are not just the youth ministry area.
So sticking with the relationship piece, because that's come up several times, and I think that that's one of the keys as you talk about integrating teens into the life of the church. Being in the United Methodist Church, we have a Wesleyan heritage. Talk a little bit about kind of the Methodist model of ministry and how John Wesley's idea sort of fit with those values of relationship and smallness.
Yeah. John Wesley was all about these small groups. I mean, I think he would have been one that would continue to push this movement that we have in youth ministry towards small groups, and small is very powerful. Often I'll meet with a church that sees themselves as unable to do much of anything in youth ministry because they have such a small youth group, and it's crazy how the small ones want to get huge and the big ones are doing everything they can to get small, because I think in the smaller numbers we find as leaders in the youth group that we can not only start to relate better with the teenagers, but we can learn more about them to help them relate with others, to help them make those connections. I used to be in our first time that we went into small group ministry, it was at Mount Bethel UMC in Marietta, and this was when we first started hearing about small groups in youth ministry, and we didn't really have too much in the way of a curriculum, but remember Scott Cleveland and I came up with, we just followed Wesley's questions and had those every single week, the exact same questions that the youth would go through in their small group. And at first you might think, well, that'd be really boring after a few weeks. But what happened was these youth and the adult leaders would realize throughout the week when they would come across a situation, here's how I'm going to answer that question of when were you closest to Christ this week, or when did you feel farthest away from God, or when did you deny God this week? Each of those three were questions that we would ask every single week, and there was a certain order to those questions, and the youth who did those small groups really seemed to enjoy them and gain a lot from them.
Mm. And I'm sure part of that is the relationships that were built with the consistency and leadership there as well, right?
Yeah.
Because you tend to stay on the surface when you don't have a good relationship formed, where there's going to be some trust and the willingness to answer those questions honestly.
Yeah.
So let's talk about your idea of sort of the investment that churches have to make into youth, right? There's a section of the book where you take the parable of the servants who are entrusted with money, and the three servants each do something different with it. Two of them, things are all right, and the last one says, oh, well, I just sort of buried it and tucked it away somewhere, put it in a silo, if you will, and didn't get anything out of it. What kind of returns does the church expect to see in young people? If we're going to invest in relationship, if we're going to try to get 5 adults per 1 youth in
Mhm.
some sort of name basis relationship with them. What's the return that you think churches expect?
Well, I think churches look to the, for the most part, look to the future as the thing that they will get out of the youth ministry. They look and they say, yeah, we need to invest in youth ministry because this is the hope for our future. This is the only way our church is going to continue to thrive, is if we have a youth ministry. Um, kind of having the idea that all of those youth are going to grow up and continue to stay in their church and in the community, which for the most part doesn't really happen. Youth move away, and that's what happens. But I think that in having that kind of an expectation, we're really selling ourselves short in what we can find as a blessing in embracing youth and children ministry in the whole life of the church. Jesus said that in order to experience the kingdom of heaven, we have to become like children. I think one of the best ways of doing that is by rubbing elbows with children in worship, by sitting and listening to them and participating with them in our different ministries in the church. Same for teenagers and youth in the church. And if we don't experience them in the life of the congregation, then we're not going to experience that part of the kingdom. And so in that way, what we can get, if you want to put it that way, from youth ministry is something we can experience right now instead of just when the teenagers grow older. And also, that opens up all sorts of ways of bringing the youth into the ministries of the church, into the leadership, into the committees. Granted, a youth doesn't have experience leading a committee, but they could shadow various people that serve in the committee for the purpose of not only learning about leadership, but even more so developing the relationship with the people in the committee, to where they just know them, and they know this youth or these 2 or 3 youth that are helping to plan Vacation Bible School or helping to discuss the missions of the church and how they're reaching out into the community.
In the book, you've got a really well fleshed out chapter on sort of, the hows, almost like places that you can start, looking at, integrating folks, more thoroughly in your church. And I think I want to get to that in a little bit. There's a story that you have about Anne from Emory.
Yeah.
I think it's in chapter 4. And I don't want to give the whole, story away because it's a great story. And I think it's one that almost every youth leader has been in a position where you're on a retreat or you're on a mission trip and it's been a long day. You've been around kids all day. Kids have been around you all day. All you want them to do is to go to bed. You've got your lights out at midnight. You just want to be able to shut the door and people fall asleep and wake up at 8 o'clock in time for breakfast the next day.
Right.
And there's this great story about sort of the presentness of adults and how kids actually really crave fully present adults as opposed to ones who just sort of ring the room and are there for supervision. Can you talk about maybe other little parts of that story or other experiences you've had where youth crave that fully present adult?
Oh, yeah. The story is actually from Beth Corey, and I don't even think she's the one that originally told it. I think she wrote it up for a book that she's coming out with soon. Beth is the director of the youth ministry or youth theology institute over there at Candler. But it's a story that took place during that time, and basically, like you say, without giving the whole story away, it's a particular adult who decided to be more present with the girls that she kind of oversaw in the downtime of YTI in the evenings as they were preparing for bed, and just in those weeks that she spent with them, they got to see her not as just this adult that was holding up the wall or coming in and telling them, lights out, you need to be quiet and go to bed, but somebody that was treating them basically as individuals to be loved, and was allowing herself, this adult, allowing herself to be the presence of Christ to the youth. And I have seen that need on so many youth ministry activities, whether it be at a youth group on a Sunday or a Wednesday night, where I've got plenty of adults there, but most of them are just standing along the walls or behind the food table, making sure that there's enough food, or making sure that the noisy kid doesn't get too rambunctious or disruptive of the rest of the group. And I know that these adults are frustrated at those times. In fact, I've had many of them come to me and say, this is not what I thought I would be doing. I want to be used for something. And myself as a youth minister didn't do a very good job at the beginning in some of those cases of communicating to them how they can be present instead of just be a chaperone, but how they can be the Christ in the room. Getting to know a few of the youth, listening to what they say, what their stories are, engaging them in that conversation, and just being present with them, not for the purpose of forcing some moral understanding on them, but for the purpose of being with them.
We're both children of God, and
yeah. Well, it's the whole incarnation. It's the willingness of Christ that Christ had, that God had to exist with us, whether we accepted what God wanted at the time or not, and to love us regardless of whether it changed us right away. And Andrew Root talks about that in his book Revisiting Relational Youth Ministry, and even about the struggle of bringing that into a congregation and getting the congregation excited about being the presence of Christ in relationships. But then when they were, and they saw the way the kids were acting, they were like, this isn't working. I can't do this because the kids aren't paying attention to, they're not being transformed, they're not being changed. And Root's point was, you've got to just be there with them and let them know that the purpose that you're there is not some ulterior motive, but it's because you love them, it's because you care for them, and they end up respecting that. And growing from it.
And the transformation isn't always on the time scale that we'd like it to be.
No,
no. We may very well never see the transformations that get to take.
More than likely we won't, and I think that's also the job of the youth minister to really prepare the volunteers for that, and to help them to see that and to trust that what they do, if they put that in the hands of God, and if they allow the Christ to act through them, then what they do will be seeds that God will allow to grow in the time that is necessary. And it might not be something that, it probably won't be in something that you're going to see the results of anytime real soon. I've been blessed over my years to hear about some of the ways that those seeds that were planted so long ago did come to some type of fruitfulness, but only a few, and each time that happens, it's wonderful to hear about, but it's certainly not expected anymore.
So let's say that I am at a church. I'm part of a congregation that has like a crazy vibrant youth worship that's going on.
Yeah, something that's really seems really going really well.
Really going well. It's at the same time as the regular congregation worship service.
Mm-hmm.
What would you recommend in terms of a conversation there?
I have visited a few churches that are like that. They're usually the larger churches, but for a number of reasons, maybe because they just don't have room in the sanctuary for the youth to be there and the adults. Others maybe because their numbers were going really low for a while and they wanted to really ramp up the youth participation on Sunday mornings. They're tired of the youth hanging out in the halls, and so they said, let's have a youth worship at the same time that we have regular church worship. I don't think that's a healthy model, because it does immediately set up a silo and set up walls that are really hard to tear down. And many people don't even see the reason to tear them down, because they'll say, you're getting youth in the doors and they're participating in worship, where before they were hanging out in the hallway, so we must be successful because we're bringing them into worship. Again, that goes back to that question of how do we rate success. And if the success there was just to get more kids in worship, then yeah, you're right, we're getting really successful in that. But if it's to sustain that worship and that ministry, that relationship between Christ and the congregation and the youth beyond their youth ministry ages, I'm not sure that's going to work. I've seen too many youth come out of that youth worship after they've graduated high school, and they're not willing to participate in the regular church worship. So what I would usually recommend, or what I usually tell a church when I see something like that, is I ask them, first off, what are you doing to offset the division that is happening on a Sunday morning? The Sticky Faith has told us that the most powerful, the single most influential ministry that happens in a church that continues to keep youth involved when they become young adults, the single most influential ministry that young adults who are active in the church can point to, that they all engaged in, is a corporate worship, congregational worship. So when we take that out, we've got to make up for it somehow. And I guess what I would do is I would encourage a church a youth minister to start talking about that in the church council meetings with the congregational meetings, explaining to them, we have this set up right now where the youth are coming to worship at the same time that the adults do, that the rest of the congregation does, and explaining it's my goal to eventually change that to where the youth and the adults want to worship together, if at all possible, and explaining at those meetings why this is important. But in the meantime, there are some things that we've got to do to offset that. We can start having youth involved each Sunday if possible, but at least a few times a month, in the regular congregational worship. And I don't mean a youth Sunday, I mean youth serving with the ushers on Sunday morning, or serving as liturgists, or singing in the choir with the rest of the regular congregational choir. Being a musician up front, offering some kind of artwork or creative addition to worship. And the other thing we can start focusing on is trying to bring adults from the rest of the congregation into the youth worship. I think a lot of times we look at it the one direction, how can we get youth more involved in worship? But if we have a youth worship going on, we should always, even if it's on a different day, always be looking for ways to bring some of the adults in the congregation into the youth worship. They can be sharing their stories, their faith stories. They can talk a little bit about their struggles. They can share their own musical ability, or serve as greeters. They don't have to be volunteers in the whole youth ministry program. They can participate in worship just in some small part as a liturgist, just like we would bring youth into the adult worship or the congregational worship. Having youth serve on the worship planning team, or on the worship ministry council, or whatever your church calls it. If for any reason, just to be give feedback on ways to help worship be more engaging of the teenagers in the community.
I think of the experiences that I had, when I was a youth minister, and I tried, one year. We did communion on the first Sunday of every month, because whatever, that's Communion Sunday. It's what we do. So let's be up in worship along with everybody else. And so there was no Sunday school. We didn't run a youth worship at the same time, but Sunday school was at the same time as worship. So first Sunday of every month was, worship Sunday, and my attendance did this. It was like, oh, it's one of those. Yeah. Let's go to the Starbucks down the street and talk.
Yeah, yeah, and you know, to be honest, that's the way we do it at the church where I attend right now. And there's a great example of a church that tried to get the youth back on a Sunday night a few years ago. The youth just were not coming, and they found that the youth come on Sunday morning, and so they decided Sunday morning will be the regular youth group time, and they meet on a Sunday morning from 10:30 to 12:15, and they have a very powerful youth worship and some share time, some small group time. And me, as the father of a 14-year-old, I drive up, I drop my daughter off at the youth building, and then my wife and I go on to worship. Or actually, we're 2-hour worshipers, so we go at 9:30. Megan has to come with us, and then the next hour she goes up to the youth building. So we have found a way through that on the Sundays that we can do that. But on the first Sunday of the month, because we see that so many people in the congregation just use it as a 1-hour time, drop the kid off, and then go to worship. On the first Sunday of the month, the youth ministry has said we need to all be together, and so we'll have communion, like you said. And unfortunately, what happens is they wake up and they say, well, we don't have youth group today, let's not go. And so yeah, we need to figure out some ways around that, and we are trying to talk about it and figure out ways to get the youth there on that Sunday. But eventually, I would hope that the movement would be toward if they do need to continue to be separated like that, then some way of continuing to develop the relationship and to integrate the adults that are worshiping with the youth that are worshiping.
Yeah, I resonate so strongly with those pieces because, yeah, you know, when you just try it once or twice and it's not part of the relationship that's built there, of course you're gonna say, oh, you know, my thing's not going on today, so
yeah,
see you next week.
When really it's one of the most important things that are going on. You know,
right.
Not only is it the worship of the whole community, but it's the recognition of that main symbol of grace and the presence of our Christ with us, which we recognize He's with us always, but in worship on that Sunday when we do communion, we're celebrating that presence, we're partaking of that presence. What a great thing to do as a whole community of faith, a communion, literally a communion of the congregation.
Well, we've been going for about 45 minutes, so I still have a little bit of water left in my cup, so I think I'm going to ask one more question and see what direction it takes us, and then we'll probably wrap some stuff up. But like I mentioned before, you do have a lot of the why it's really important to do this integration work of teenagers into the whole life of the church. You talk a lot about the whys of paying attention to intergenerational activities and places that people do connect. So let's get into some of the hows. You've got a chapter that does something called the intergenerational perception activity, which sounded like kind of a fun place to start, and just by itself, I think would be worth picking up the book for. But talk a little bit about that. Is that a starting place that you've identified for folks, or how does that fit in?
Well, I think that I definitely wouldn't go into that without first reading the book, and the book is a pretty quick read, but it's a chapter that has a questionnaire, and the idea is to pass these questions around to your whole church, your youth, your adults, people who are involved in youth, but especially just as well the people who have never set foot in the room with a teenager, the staff especially, parents, and it has all sorts of questions about things that go on in your congregation and how much you have seen somebody that is not your age participating in those things that you participate in. So it can be answered from the youth perspective or from the adult perspective. And then the youth minister or the person who's giving out those questions would tally those up and figure out a score of how integrated the integration score, if you will, that congregation is, or at least how integrated it's perceived to be. It very, very well may be that there are a number of youth in worship, but many people in the congregation don't see them. When I was growing up and involved as a teenager in worship, we sat on the very, very back row. And the only ones that would see us sitting there were the ones who would come in after we sat down, and or would leave before we did. And we were usually the first to leave as well, since we were the back row. But I think that even the perception is an important thing to look at and to rate. So you come out with this feedback, and then the second part of that is to have an evening or a experience of informing the church members of what they discovered on the questions. It has some statistics. It has some information that you can post from what you discovered in your questions. It has some discussion questions and some activities that are listed. It's kind of like a program to run people through that helps them to recognize what it means to be a community of faith that looks at everyone's experiences with God instead of just one age group's experiences.
I think that was the part that spoke strongest to me in reading through that activity, because perception is reality in a lot of places, right?
Yeah.
And I think it really does a good job of collecting feedback and collecting perceptions, not only from multiple age groups, but from different ministry areas of the church. I mean, we've talked about youth ministry as a silo, but if we're honest, I mean, there's plenty of ministries that tend towards that silo nature.
Yeah.
Doesn't necessarily just have to be youth. So taking time to get perception from across the board really is a helpful thing.
Definitely, there are things and comments and suggestions in the book that I think could be easily relatable into other areas of ministry. This last year at our annual conference in North Georgia, the Bishop Watson had helped us in determining that that the theme for annual conference was going to be youth, children, young adults, camping, campuses, those ministries, and as we started planning that, at first we were trying to figure out how we were going to present each of those ministries as something important, and we started figuring out that we would have speakers come up each time and talk about the importance of children's ministry, and then talk about the importance of youth ministry, and then somebody else come up and talk about what to do to strengthen your young adult ministry. And you can see what was starting to happen there is basically we were just communicating again how to build up the silo. Mm-hmm. And in our planning sessions at one point early on, we said we're just pushing the same thing we're trying to fix here. And so instead we worked our special focus times on worship, hospitality, missions, the things that every congregation encounters. And then in those sessions, in those breakout times or those short talks, we focused on ways to get children involved in worship, or ways to help youth be involved in hospitality or fellowship, ways to be missional as a community with college students or young adults, so that way, even if a church says we don't have any youth, why should we talk to you about building our youth ministry? We don't have any youth to even reach out to. That means there are ways that a church can be very involved in youth ministry in their community and still not have any youth in their congregation. Mm. And that's really exciting when you think about it. It's kind of like a couple that can't have children that decides they're going to adopt or be foster parents or do whatever they can to be involved in the lives of the children in their community. There are all sorts of ways that a church can be ministering to youth without having youth as members of their church, and that is what connects them, youth and children, with the kingdom. If a church is without youth and children, they're missing out on so much of what they can experience in the kingdom.
Well, Sam, I think that is the perfect note to kind of leave it on, because the opportunities that we have to connect and be intergenerational, I think, are really important, and whatever we can do to find new ways of making sure that teenagers are part of that one body. It's an image that is deeply rooted in all sorts of Christian traditions, that one body. And so I'm really thankful that you were able to put that book together. I'm thankful that the Youth Cartel was able to publish it. I do encourage people to check it out. Again, it's let me make sure I get the title right, because it is,
Okay.
one of those long subtitles. One Body, Integrating Teenagers into the Life of Your Church.
Yes.
Awesome. We'll make sure to have the link to where you can get it on the Youth Cartel's website once our Hangout today is archived on the YPM YouTube channel.
Okay, and you could also put my email on that if you'd like. People can email me if there's something they need or have any questions. It's sam.halverson, sam.halverson @ngumc.net.
Okay, I'll make sure that that's there. I will not put up your personal cell phone number because
Thank you.
I wouldn't do that to you. Not yet, anyway. But Sam, thanks a ton for the time today. And to those 9, 10, 11 viewers that have been tuning in and watching us and hanging out with us, we're really thankful that you watched along with us. Know that we'll be holding your ministries in our prayers, and we really encourage you to keep exploring new and innovative ways to keep connecting teenagers and adults within the church congregations that you're a part of. Relationships are really what it's all about, and the United Methodist Church is in a great spot to be looking at relationships and relational ministry. So Sam, thanks again for your time.
Thank you, Chris.